The Hargrove estate filled every room with warm gold light and the sound of crystal meeting crystal. But near the far wall, close to the glass door that opened onto the garden, a woman sat completely alone. Her hands gripped her water glass so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. No one stopped. No one offered her a place in their circle. Some guests glanced her way and turned deliberately away, as though remaining unaware of her was a social courtesy they were all performing together. Then a tall black man in a plain navy blazer stepped through the entrance, looked around the room once, and what he did next made every person in that house go completely still. Marcus Delroy Webb had spent the drive from Buckhead to Annesley Park the same way he spent most drives, quietly, with the radio low, running through the mental checklist of things that needed doing before the week was out. He was 41 years old and had been running checklists in his head for so long that the habit had become indistinguishable from thought itself. A safety inspection at the Midtown site first thing Monday, Zoe's school conference on Wednesday, groceries on the way home tonight. If the party ended at a reasonable hour, he worked as a construction safety engineer for a mid-sized firm in Atlanta, the kind of work that was precise, necessary, and almost entirely invisible to everyone who benefited from it. He reviewed load calculations and stress tolerances and evacuation protocols. He walked job sites at 5 in the morning with a flashlight and a clipboard and a trained eye for the kinds of failures that looked harmless right up until they weren't: the hairline fracture in the support column, the incorrectly rated electrical panel, the exit route that had been partially blocked for so long that no one working there thought to question it anymore. The work suited him in ways he had stopped trying to explain to people who asked what he did and then visibly lost interest before he finished the sentence. He had decided a long time ago that the things worth doing were rarely the things that attracted admiration, and he had made his peace with that. His wife Diana had died 4 years ago. A car accident on I-285 on a Thursday morning in November, the kind of event that rearranges everything so completely that you stop trying to locate the person you were before it and start learning to be the person left standing after. He had learned slowly and without ceremony. He had learned to braid Zoe's hair without pulling too tight at the temples. He had learned which textures of food she would tolerate on any given day, and which ones she would push quietly to the edge of her plate. He kept a travel pack of tissues in his jacket pocket, because she had her mother's tendency towards sudden allergies, and being caught without one had cost him enough embarrassed, scrambling, that he had simply stopped leaving home. Without it, he had not wanted to come tonight. He had stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom in the navy blazer he had owned for 3 years, and he had thought about calling Marcus Ellington, the colleague who invited him, the man who had driven 40 minutes in rain to help him move out of the house he and Diana had shared, and offering some reasonable excuse. He had not made the call. He owed Marcus Ellington more than one evening of showing up. He pulled into the estate's circular driveway, handed his keys to the valet, and walked toward the entrance with his hands easy at his sides. He read the room the way he always read a space, not looking for danger, but assessing it, where the weight was, which direction the social current was running, who was comfortable, and who was performing comfort. It was a habit from his years in fire suppression, and he had never entirely lost it. And that was when he saw her, near the glass door, alone in the specific way that made clear the aloneness was not accidental. Claire Moreau had told herself she would stay for 45 minutes. She had made this calculation in the car before walking in, sitting in the Hargrove driveway with the engine still running, reminding herself that it was one evening, that she was a functioning adult, that she had survived considerably harder things than feeling like a ghost in a room full of people who had decided to stop seeing her. She had survived the divorce. She had survived the 9-month custody dispute over Noah, who was 5 years old and currently asleep at her neighbor's house. She had survived Derek's version of events being circulated through their mutual social circle with the efficiency of someone who understood that the story told first tends to be the story that sticks. Derek Moreau had been methodical in the way he dismantled things. He had told people she was cold, professionally obsessed, emotionally unavailable, a version of her that was just credible enough to be believed by people who had never looked closely enough to check. Their mutual friends had accepted his version not because they believed it fully, but because believing it was easier than the alternative, which required them to have an opinion and possibly take a side. She had lost a house in the settlement. She had lost the social world that came with the marriage, one by one. In the polite and bloodless way those losses happen. The unanswered texts, the dropped plans, the gradual silence spreading through a group chat until no one bothered to acknowledge it was over. She had checked that chat for the last time on a Tuesday in January and deleted it. What remained was Noah and a rented house on the east side of the city, and a job she had returned to after years away, and the daily invisible effort of making all of it look manageable. She was not fragile. She had made a point every day of not being fragile, but some nights the effort was enormous. Tonight was one of those nights. Sylvia Hargrove had met her at the front door, with warmth that was technically flawless, both hands extended, a comment about how lovely it was that Claire had made it, a brief tour of the drinks table that ended with Sylvia drifting towards someone whose conversation she clearly preferred. Claire had understood the mechanism of the invitation within the first 10 minutes. She had sat down near the glass door because it was the farthest point from the room's center of gravity, and she had told herself she just needed a moment before she found someone to talk to. The moment stretched. No one came. She checked her phone. The sitter had texted to confirm Noah was asleep and everything was fine. What Claire did not know, what she could not have known, was that Marcus Webb was standing 20 feet away and had just heard Sylvia Hargrove lean toward the woman beside her and say quietly, with the confidence of someone who assumes they will not be overheard, "I invited her because Derek asked me to check in on her. Make sure she was holding together." Marcus said nothing. He looked back toward the woman by the glass door, and something settled into place inside him. The quiet, specific recognition of a situation. He now understood more completely than he had 30 seconds earlier. The room had arranged itself around Claire Moreau, the way water arranges itself around an obstacle naturally, without discussion, without anyone needing to say out loud that this was what they were doing. The people who had once called her a friend moved through the space as though her corner did not exist. A group of women near the bar, who had been in the same social circle as Claire, exchanged a glance when she arrived and turned back to each other without speaking. It was a transaction completed in under 2 seconds. No one had organized it. No one needed to. A man named Gavin Rourke, thick-shouldered, in a black suit that announced its cost without specifying it, a long-standing business partner of Derek's, drifted past Claire's table with the unhurried ease of someone who had learned to deliver small cruelties at the exact speed that made them look accidental. He said, without quite addressing her, "Still in this part of town? I figured you'd have moved on by now." A few people nearby registered the comment. One or two managed small smiles, not the kind that meant they found it funny, but the cautious kind that meant they were watching to see what she would do. Claire kept her posture straight. She did not respond. She had learned over the past year that responding offered people who had already made up their minds an opportunity to confirm what they had decided. She looked at her water glass and thought about Noah asleep at her neighbor's house, and told herself 15 more minutes. Marcus watched the exchange from across the room. He couldn't hear the words at this distance, but he had spent enough years reading people under pressure to understand the shape of what was happening without needing the audio. He saw the way Gavin lingered just long enough to deliver whatever he had said, then moved on with the ease of a man who had perfected the art of saying cruel things in a register that made them technically undeniable. He saw the controlled stillness that settled over Claire afterward. Not the stillness of someone who was fine, but the stillness of someone who had learned, through repetition, that reacting only ever made the arithmetic worse. He had felt that particular stillness himself. He knew its specific weight. He had stood in rooms where the question of whether he was welcome had already been settled before he walked in, where the warmth offered to him was calibrated carefully enough to be called warmth without actually being it. He had learned to carry that knowledge without letting it change the direction he moved. He had never entirely stopped noticing it. He had simply gotten efficient at what came next. Zoe was standing beside him with one hand looped through his arm, taking in the party with her quiet, systematic attention. She was 8 years old and had developed alongside him or from him, or simply because 4 years of moving through the world together had shaped them in similar ways, the habit of watching carefully before speaking. "Dad," she said, "why is that lady sitting by herself?" He looked back across the room. Claire hadn't moved. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I don't think it's because she wants to be." Zoe considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "Then we should go sit with her." Not a question. A proposal delivered with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to dress simple moral logic in social negotiation. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Let's go." He did not check whether anyone was watching. He took a calm, even line across the floor, toward the corner where Claire sat alone, and Zoe walked beside him with Cobalt tucked under one arm and the patient, focused expression she wore when she had already made up her mind about something and was simply moving toward the conclusion. He felt the room register the movement before they arrived, not with sound, with the particular quality of attention that a space develops when something happens that doesn't follow the expected choreography. A few heads turned, conversations pulled slightly toward distraction. The smooth social certainty that had animated the room since the beginning of the evening developed something underneath it, a slight resistance. The way a room feels when someone has done something it had not accounted for. Claire looked up when she heard footsteps approach. Her expression cycled through several things in less than a second: surprise, the brace of someone preparing for something unpleasant, and then the careful blankness she had learned to wear as a default. She had expected, the way she had learned to expect things this past year, that they would walk past, that they were heading for the terrace or the bar or anywhere that wasn't her corner of the room. Instead, the man stopped. He looked at the empty chairs, then he looked at her, not with pity, not with the performance of kindness that was always somehow more exhausting than being ignored, but with the simple, unhurried attention of someone who was actually seeing her, registering her, choosing her, without ceremony, and without any need for the choice to be witnessed. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. His voice was quiet, direct. It asked a real question. "No," she said, "it isn't." He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Zoe settled into the chair on his other side and placed Cobalt on the table between them, with the deliberate care of a child conducting a formal introduction. "His name is Cobalt," she said. "He has been through a lot." Claire looked at the small blue bear, one ear clearly restitched with thread that didn't quite match, and then at the girl. "He looks like he has good stories." Zoe nodded, satisfied. It was the right answer. She had expected nothing less. Across the room, Sylvia Hargrove had stopped mid-sentence. Marcus didn't notice, or noticed and chose not to let it matter. He flagged down a passing server, asked Claire what she'd like from the appetizer table, asking her first, Zoe second, and made it into a small practical thing, instead of a gesture designed to be seen. Claire watched him do this and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It had been long enough since someone had included her in a simple courtesy, not the grand variety, not the kind that performed itself, but the ordinary texture of how people treated each other at their best, that it took her a moment to identify what she was feeling. Something close to being seen. It was such a small thing. It had become rare enough to matter. They talked after that with the naturalness of two people who had skipped the part of conversation that was really about establishing social coordinates. He asked about her work. She was a chief accountant for a logistics company, back at the job she had left during the marriage and returned to because she needed both the income and something that was unambiguously hers. She asked about his. He told her, without the apologetic framing he had learned to add when he sensed people expected it, about structural safety work and what it meant to look for the things that could fail invisibly. She listened with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than waiting for her turn. Zoe reported that horses were the finest animal in North America and demonstrated 3 positions in which Cobalt could be arranged to look either dignified or alarmed, depending on the angle. Claire laughed real laughter from somewhere deeper than courtesy. Gavin Rourke had positioned himself at the bar with the posture of a man reassessing something. He said something to the man beside him, his voice carrying just enough to reach the people nearest to him. That guy does safety checks at construction sites. Not exactly Hargrove's crowd. The man beside him produced a short laugh, the kind that was less about finding something funny and more about maintaining proximity to someone with social authority. It was the kind of laugh that communicated agreement without requiring the speaker to articulate what exactly they were agreeing with. Then a woman in a red dress said something to the person beside her, without particularly lowering her voice. Who is he exactly? What is he doing over there? The response came back with a carefully neutral inflection. He seems to know someone, but the original question had carried something more than curiosity. The word he aimed at a black man in a plain blazer who had walked across a room and sat down beside the one guest everyone else had collectively agreed to leave alone. That word carried a weight that most people in the room registered without naming. It communicated a specific variety of surprise, the kind compressed into a single syllable that communicates an assumed order has been disrupted. Some of them felt the discomfort of recognizing something about themselves in the question. The discomfort was real. None of them chose to examine it. Marcus heard it. He looked at Claire for a moment. Claire had heard it too, and was looking at the table with the composed stillness of someone who had long practice at not reacting to exactly this variety of pressure. The comment that was not quite a comment, the observation that was not quite directed at you but landed precisely where it was intended to land. He had his own version of that practice. He had been in enough rooms where his presence generated exactly that quality of question, the kind asked in a tone designed to establish that the asker had the right to ask it, to have developed a response that was not silent, exactly, but a refusal to reorganize himself around other people's discomfort. He had simply stopped doing that. It was a discipline he maintained quietly, consistently, without announcing it to anyone. He had learned that a room's discomfort with your presence was the room's problem to solve, not yours. Gavin Rourke detached himself from the bar and moved toward their table with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades using social access as a means of establishing hierarchy. He stopped a few feet from them, close enough to be part of the conversation, without technically entering it. "Marcus," he said, with the warmth of someone who had weaponized warmth over many years, "still doing the site inspections? The safety work?" There was something underneath the question, just enough condescension to be felt without being quotable. Marcus looked at him with the same level, unhurried attention he had brought to everything all evening. "Work done honestly is work worth being proud of," he said. Not a speech, not performed for anyone listening, just said, in the same plain register as everything else he said, without apology, without posturing, without any need for the room's validation. Gavin's smile flickered, just briefly, before he recovered it and said something about needing another drink and moved away. Zoe watched him go. "I do not like him," she announced. From Claire came a sound that surprised her something, between an exhale and a laugh, brief and involuntary and entirely real. Marcus looked at her with the small, uncomplicated warmth of someone sharing something private. "She is not wrong about people very often," he said. "No," Claire said. "I do not imagine she is." Theodore Marsh arrived at their table at a few minutes past 9, without announcing himself. He was 72, a retired civil rights attorney who had spent 4 decades in Atlanta courts and had attended enough Hargrove parties to be immune to their theater. He located a chair, moved it to their table without asking whether the action required permission, and sat down across from Claire, with the authority of someone who had grown comfortable moving directly toward what mattered, without waiting for an invitation to do so. "Claire Moreau," he said, "your father's daughter." She looked at him carefully, trying to place him. "Theodore Marsh. I worked with your father on the foundation board years back. Your parents and my wife were at the same hospital fundraiser. The year you organized the silent auction, you must have been in your late 20s. He settled into the chair. "You organized the pediatric fundraiser that nearly fell through when the venue canceled 3 days out. You found a replacement in 48 hours and made sure no one knew you were the one who had done it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "That was a while ago. 3 years. Not so long." He looked at her steadily. "I also know you covered medical bills for 2 of the catering staff from that event, when they ran into serious trouble the following year. Anonymously, they never knew where the money came from. They needed help," Claire said simply. "I had the means at the time." A pause. For a while. The last 3 words were said without self-pity. They contained everything anyway, the before and after. of a life that had changed faster than she had been prepared for, the compressed history of what had been had and lost, and the gap between those two things that she had been navigating alone ever since. Marcus heard it. He heard all of it. Theodore Marsh met her eyes and held them. "I know the version of you that was circulated after the divorce. I have heard it. I want you to know that the people who were paying actual attention were not persuaded by it." He did not dress it up or soften the edges of what he was saying. "The people who should have stood by you found it easier not to. That became comfortable for them very quickly. That is not a reflection of who you are. It is a reflection of what they chose." Claire's jaw tightened. She kept her expression steady, but something behind her eyes had shifted, not relief exactly, but something in the same territory. The particular sensation of having held your breath underwater for longer than you thought possible, and finding the surface without expecting to. "It has been hard to know who those people are," she said quietly. "I know," Theodore said. "That is the cruelest part of it." He stood, rested one hand briefly on her shoulder, said he hoped they would speak again before the evening was over, and moved back into the room. Marcus had listened without comment. He had recognized, at some point during the exchange, that Theodore Marsh was the same man who had signed the public infrastructure contract, that Marcus's firm had been awarded one of the largest projects his company had taken on in 3 years. He did not say this. This was not the time for it. He sat still and let the moment belong entirely to Claire. He had learned in the years since Diana died that there was a right moment to speak, and that pressing words into a silence that needed to stay silent was one of the most consistent mistakes a person could make. When Claire finally looked at him, her face was different from anything she had shown all evening. The careful composure she had been maintaining by sheer force of will had softened around the edges, and what was underneath it was simply a person tired and real and fractionally less alone than she had been 2 hours ago. "I am not used to people sitting next to me anymore," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then they have been missing out on someone worth knowing." He meant it. He said it with the same plainness he used for most things, without ornamentation, without any need to make it larger than it was. Claire looked away. Her throat moved. The music shifted sometime after 10 o'clock. It moved from the background noise that existed to fill conversational gaps into something slower and more deliberate, a piano piece, layered under soft percussion, the kind of music that asked a room to settle instead of talking over it. A few couples had already found each other on the floor, moving in the easy, unannounced way that couples move when the party has loosened and the hour has grown late enough that pretense starts to feel like too much effort. The shift in the music changed. The texture of the room made it quieter underneath the noise, made the corners more visible. Zoe looked at the dance floor. Then she looked at her father. Then she looked at Claire. She reached a conclusion with the speed of someone who had been arriving at it for the past hour. "You should ask her to dance," she said. Not a question, not a suggestion. An instruction issued by someone who had already resolved the matter on everyone's behalf. Marcus stood up. He turned toward Claire and held out his hand. "I am not a spectacular dancer," he said first, "but I am steady." Claire looked at his hand. Then she looked at him, not with wariness, but with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust what they were seeing. "I have not danced in a long time. Tonight is as good a time as any to start again." She looked at Zoe, who was sitting forward in her chair with the focused, luminous expectation of a child who has understood that something important is happening and intends to witness every moment of it. "Go," Zoe said, with the simple authority of someone who had already determined the correct outcome. Claire laughed brief, surprised, entirely unguarded, and took his hand. They walked to the floor together. Marcus moved the way he did everything steadily, without pretense, keeping it simple. His hand was certain at her back, and he kept the right distance, and he was entirely present in the only way that mattered. Not checking the room, not monitoring reactions, simply there. And that was what the room could not look away from, because the room had been watching all evening, tracking the corner by the glass door, noting who sat there and who did not. And what it was watching now was something it could not quite categorize, and therefore could not dismiss. When they stepped onto the floor together, a black man in a plain blazer and a white woman, The room had collectively spent the evening making invisible. Something moved through the space that was not quite discomfort and not quite surprise, but occupied the territory between them. A man at the bar looked away too quickly. A woman in a deep rose gown said something low to the person beside her. Sylvia Hargrove stood near the terrace doors with a drink she was no longer tasting, watching the floor, with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that her party had been telling a story all evening that was not the one she had designed. Marcus did not look around. He did not need to know what the room thought. He kept his hand steady at Claire's back and stayed where he was fully present. The music, the floor, the woman in front of him, who was dancing again for the first time in a long time and was not pretending it did not matter. He had always believed that the most important quality a person could bring to another person's company was simply the quality of being genuinely there, not managing the interaction, not monitoring how it was being received, not calculating what it meant, just being present with another person as though their presence was worth your full attention. It was a simpler thing than most people seemed to find it. He had long since decided to stop complicating it. The song ended. They stood for a brief moment, in the natural pause that follows when music stops and the world outside reasserts itself. Claire stepped back. Marcus let her. Neither of them made it into anything beyond what it was. Neither of them felt the need to, but when they walked back to their corner, something in the room had changed. Not visibly, not announced, but in the way a room changes when several people have simultaneously been confronted with something they had not expected to see, and have not yet found a comfortable way to catalog it. The room had gone quieter in the particular way that happens not after entertainment, but after reckoning. The music was still playing. The glasses were still full. The hired photographers still moved along the edges of the room, but the ease that had animated the room at the beginning of the evening had developed something underneath it, a quality of self-awareness that was not comfortable, and that most people were managing by focusing on their nearest conversation with slightly more attention than it deserved. Gavin Rourke had drifted into the hallway beyond the dining room sometime during the last song. The easy malice that had animated him all evening had deflated in the absence of an audience willing to sustain it. He stood in the corridor with a drink he was no longer interested in. The authority he had been projecting all night had gone quiet in a way he was not yet ready to process. The thing about a room turning was that it happened without announcement. One moment the current was running your way, and the next it simply was not. And there was no clean moment you could point to when it changed. The woman in the red dress stood at the edge of a conversation she was no longer fully participating in, holding her glass and looking at nothing specific with an expression she could not quite neutralize. She had asked who he was earlier, meaning something particular by the question. The room had not confirmed what she expected it to confirm. That required some time to settle. The woman who had once been in Claire's group chat, who had attended the same dinners, been in the same text thread for 2 years before it went quiet, who had spent this entire evening navigating carefully around the corner, where Claire sat, approached their table as Marcus and Claire returned. She had been moving toward this moment for the last 30 minutes, without fully committing to it. She stood at the edge of the table for a moment, holding her clutch with both hands. Then she said, in the careful voice of someone saying something true that is arriving considerably later than it should have, "I am glad you came." Claire looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing performing itself in Claire's face. "Thank you," she said simply, nothing added. The woman nodded and left. Sylvia Hargrove found Marcus near the end of the evening, closer to 11 than 10. She was warm in a way she had not been at the beginning of the night, asking about his firm, mentioning someone she thought he really ought to meet. Marcus was polite and gave her nothing she could use. Claire, standing beside him, watched the shift and understood it exactly. Sylvia had recalibrated her assessment of Marcus not because he was different than he had been 3 hours ago, but because the room had decided he mattered, and Sylvia's social arithmetic updated accordingly. He had been the same person all evening. Only the way the room looked at him had changed. That was the thing about certain kinds of rooms. They did not change the people inside them. They only revealed, eventually, what the people inside them had already decided to be. They stepped outside just before midnight. The estate's driveway was quiet. The valet stand empty. The row of low lanterns still burning along the garden path. The early spring air in Atlanta had the particular clarity of a season that is not fully committed yet clean, and slightly sharp, the kind of air that makes you breathe more deliberately and feel more awake than you expected to. After 3 hours in a room designed to be looked at, the open sky was a relief. Zoe had fallen asleep against Marcus's shoulder during the last half hour of the party, one arm around Cobalt, one hand loosely gripping the sleeve of Claire's jacket, in the boneless way children reach for whatever is nearby when they are between waking and sleep and simply want something real to hold. Claire had not moved away. She walked beside them down the stone path, not thinking about much for the first time all evening. The quiet was different here. Not the empty quiet of her rented house at night. Not the particular variety of silence that was really just absence arranged in the shape of a room. This was something with texture and company in it. She let it be what it was, without naming it. At the end of the driveway, they stopped, under the open sky. The city was present in the distant Atlanta at night, the low luminance of it against the underside of the clouds, the ordinary, unremarkable world continuing as it always did. "I had a plan," Claire said. She was looking out at the quiet street beyond the hedges. 45 minutes, then back to my car. Sit there for a bit. She paused. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Anyone who had ever made that kind of plan, the careful retreat from a room before, it had a chance to cost you more than you had budgeted for, understood what came at the end of it. The sitting alone in a dark car with the heater running, not quite ready to go home, not quite ready for the night to become ordinary again. Marcus understood. He had made versions of that plan more times than he could count, calculating exactly how long he needed to stay to honor the obligation without exposing himself to more of the evening than he could manage. He had gotten efficient at it. He was not entirely sure when he had stopped needing to. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "So am I." She said it without decoration, as though she had just confirmed it was true, and wanted to say it out loud, while it still felt right to before the habit of understatement could reassert itself. She looked at Zoe, asleep against his shoulder. Something moved across her face, quiet and careful. The way people look at things they are not yet sure they are permitted to want. "She is extraordinary," Claire said. "She is," Marcus said. He looked at his daughter for a moment, then back at Claire. "She saw you before I did, to be honest. She is the one who suggested we go over." Claire looked at Zoe one more time. "She is 8, she said. "The obvious answer is usually the right one." "Usually," he said. "We would all do better to remember that." Marcus placed Zoe carefully into the back seat of his car. The girl shifted without waking, found a comfortable angle against the seat, and settled with Cobalt tucked under her chin and the expression of someone deep in a dream that was going well. He closed the door gently and stood beside the car, looking back toward the end of the driveway, where Claire was standing under the last of the garden lanterns. He thought about the man who had stood in front of a mirror earlier that evening in a plain suit and expected nothing from the night except the obligation of attendance. He thought about 4 years of learning to be enough for one small person, and the way he had gradually come to believe that this was the complete shape of what remained for him, that the perimeter of his life had been drawn, and what was inside it was sufficient, and he should stop looking past the edges. He had stopped attending most things that required him to stand in a room full of people and perform a version of himself that had nothing to do with who he actually was. He could not have told you, standing in that driveway under the open Atlanta sky, what the next thing would look like. He had not yet found the language for it. This conversation, this woman standing at the end of someone else's driveway, the way an evening had moved from obligation into something else entirely, without any design of his that he could trace. He was not going to name any of it before it was ready to be named. That was not how he did things, but something had shifted, something small and real, the way the most significant things almost always are not announced, not performed, not designed to be witnessed. Claire walked toward the car to say goodnight. Zoe's eyes opened briefly in the back seat, found Claire in the dim light cast by the lanterns, and then closed again, with the composed satisfaction of a child who had checked on a situation, confirmed it was exactly as it should be, and returned to sleep without any need for further comment. Marcus looked at Claire. "You were asking earlier what you are still good at," he said. "What is actually yours?" "Still finding out," she said. "I think you are looking in the right direction, not a promise. Not an invitation beyond what the moment held, simply what he believed, said in the same plain register he had used all evening, without decoration, without any need to make it into more than it was. And that was the thing that stayed with her longest, on the drive home through the quiet Atlanta streets. Not what had happened inside the Hargrove estate, not Gavin Rourke's remark, or Sylvia's recalibrated warmth, or even Theodore Marsh's quiet vindication. What stayed with her was this: that a complete stranger had walked across a room and sat down beside her for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do. That his daughter had asked a simple question and received a simple answer, and that had been sufficient. That in a room full of people performing versions of themselves that required looking away from certain things and certain people, a man who simply chose not to look away was the loudest thing there. He had not fixed anything. He had not resolved the divorce or restored what had been taken from her. He had only chosen to sit beside her. And somehow, in that room, on that night, that had been enough to change everything.